Last week we considered the mysterious chemistries of sensory perception, and now we must try to examine the nature of the self that thinks. When we use this term, the self that thinks, we say it this way because most persons are convinced that the thinker in themselves is themselves. This identification of the being with its own mental processes has disturbed philosophy for a very long time and is beginning to disturb modern psychology. In the modern point of view, the future of man is rather dismal if his salvation depends entirely on his own mind. It is obvious that whatever this mind may be, it is not infallible. That it is not capable of, with certainty and inevitable correctness, approaching any situation. The mind is not an independent solver of problems. From it comes no infallible revelation about things to be done or changes to be made in human conduct. Rather, the mind seems to be a rather doddering factor, one minute strong for right, and the next strong for weakness. In some way, society as we know it, this vast, confused hodgepodge of individuals, nations, races, cultural systems, religions, political theories, is the projection together of mind. Therefore, if we want to understand the mind, we may as well look not only within us, but around us. For it is the reason for the infinite disagreement. It is the reason for all the self-pity, for all the quick accusations against others. It sustains the countless intemperances which burden and afflict us. And it is forever seeking ways of self-justification, not only wrong, but it is determined to force that wrong upon itself and upon others. Therefore, while the mind certainly reposes somewhere within the interiorness of ourselves and is not part of our visible constitution, it is forever influencing the visible part of us. It affects our styles and our clothing. It affects our health. It ties us to most extraordinary and unreasonable occupations. It burdens us with pride, tears us down with grief, and continues to operate more or less with or without our consent. I've talked to many persons who were developing what might be termed in the old days mental miseries. And you ask these people, do you want to be miserable? Are you enjoying this process of intellectually flagellating yourself? Do you choose unhappiness as your pattern for life? Most of these folks will say no, that they really want to be happy, but they feel like being miserable, so they are miserable. It seems as though the very nature of the mind is such that it refuses to rescue the person from the clutches of its own intensities. What have we to fight mind with except mind? How can we diagnose our thoughts except by thinking? How can we examine our knowledge without using our various mental faculties for this very examination? It looks, therefore, in many cases as though the judge is bribed and the jury corrupted. There seems to be no sense of escape from the tyranny of a faculty which occupies all the important seats in the cabinet of our executive government. We find everywhere notions carried along with splendid fervor and principles perishing from disregard. Our philosophic friends, therefore, tried to think through the problem of how the mind operates and why it is such an unmitigated nuisance in so many careers. We can only assume that the mind, like almost any other part of the personality, is an instrument incomplete, imperfect, unfinished. That to expect maturity of the mind is to expect maturity of a child. Simply because the body has reached what might be considered an age of discretion, we expect the person to be discreet, but he may very well lack the ability to meet these expectations. We have to recognize that the mind itself is a structure that does not automatically accomplish any good thing, automatically does not accomplish any evil thing. The mind is an instrument, a tool, like a workman's hammer, or his plane, or his saw, or his chisel. It depends upon the workman and how he uses these instruments, whether his work is well done or not well done. The skill is not in the instrument, but in the master who uses it. And in man, the power of the mind is not merely in the faculties themselves, but in some restraint over and above those faculties. Some means of bringing this mental instrument into harmony and order. Last week we were discussing the mental coordinator. And I had a letter a few days ago asking me who he was. Now, I probably was a little lax in not giving a clearer definition of the usage in that particular case, but we have discussed it so much in recent years, I overlooked this need. But the mental coordinator is simply this sixth instrument of the machine of the senses. The mental coordinator is the power which brings phenomena together, organizes it, and sets up relationships between things which, in their unrelated state, contribute no insight or understanding to the individual. This mental coordinator is consequently the power to estimate the findings of various sensory perceptions, reconcile them, discover their consistencies and their inconsistencies, and, if necessary, make up for the deficiencies of some faculty which may be impaired. In various ways, this coordinator, therefore, merely summarizes the immediate reflexes of man's perceptions to the stimuli of environment. The coordinator, however, seemingly exercises this additional power. It gradually takes on the appearance of being a thinker. Now, this might not be so dangerous if we understood the true meaning of the word thinker. But we like to assume that this is some kind of a superior mental genius, a person with a vast reputation for erudition is referred to as a thinker. This should imply that he is sober, deep in his consideration of things, adequate in his experience to weigh, estimate, and measure the validity of report. It is also assumed that the thinker is moved by some deep principles within himself to think nobly, and to gradually recover from the phenomena of nature some concept of the universal plan to which this phenomena bears witness. The thinker, therefore, is a person who can answer the question, what does the universe mean to me? At least even reach out toward the opposing concept. What do I mean to the universe? Actually, however, we are not quite sure in practice just what this thinking process accomplishes. For example, what do we think? What is the process by which we stimulate ideas in the mind? Experiments have indicated that this coordinator, this thinker within ourselves, largely thinks in terms of words. In the German, the mental coordinator is a German, speaking the German language. Perhaps High German or Low German, or one of the dialects, according to the district from which it comes. This same mental coordinator may be Spanish, if the body is Spanish. It will think in the Spanish language. And one of the tests that comes to one who is studying a foreign language is when, after considerable effort and time, and perhaps a great deal of patience, the student of language suddenly discovers that he is able to think in the terms of the new language he is seeking to understand. The moment he can think in that language, he possesses it. The moment he can think in it, he can bring the various necessary words of conversation into the forepart of his consciousness at will. But until he thinks in the language, he hesitates, he falters, and he has none of that assurance or insight into the psychological values that accompany the different languages of the world. So when we think of God, what do we really think about? Do we have any clear insight as to the nature of divine being? Or are we thinking G-O-D? When we think in terms of a tree, and we ask ourselves what is a tree, almost certainly this coordinator produces a series of words, synonyms or neo-synonyms, numerous or scant according to our own possession of vocabulary. When we ask a person, what color is this tree? He says green. Now, this is simply because green is available to him. He knows no more about the tree than he did before. So what we call thinking very largely is a transmission of certain common observations by means of a common language. We have no assurance at all that the thinking process instinctively seeks any real solution to anything. It merely substitutes one group of words for another. And when we are confronted with problems, we meet them with words. We meet them with words that are not solutional of anything in themselves. We go for help to someone else. He gives us good advice. This advice is given in words. It is accepted into our own mental coordinator as words. It remains there as words. And perhaps at some future time we cheerfully give these words on as priceless advice to somebody else. But in the interval, we have not done anything much with them ourselves. They are simply words. Whether these words be written or spoken, they would imply that the word concept, the language concept, actually is rooted in the mental life of the individual. Therefore, that in this mental life, he belongs to the same kind of world that he belongs to physically. How then shall we attempt to understand how the mind has gained its peculiar authority in the direction of our living? Remember, the mind is in the position to accept, compare all kinds of phenomenal material. The mind also has a further ability within itself, arising from its own very nature, and that is that it can project its own conclusions in strict harmony with traditional experience or observation, but not beyond. Thus it may happen that the mind can perform certain useful functions. Supposing we stand two objects side by side on a table. One is a large melon, and the other is a small melon. We immediately turn our attention upon the problems suggested by the presence of a melon. The most simple, natural, inevitable process would be to attend to one melon and say, this is a melon. Attend to the other melon and say, this is a melon, and consider the deal closed. But we don't do that. The moment there are two melons, something happens. Instinctively, without realizing it or without knowing why we do it, we come to certain conclusions about our two melons. Somewhere arises within ourselves not only the discovery that there are two melons, but that one melon is larger than the other melon. This requires a little further consideration. We now have had to bring in the faculty of comparison. Then we may notice that one melon is a little riper than the other melon. This may invite that we eat the riper melon first. This is further testimony about melon. Now, there are many kinds of melons in the world which we know only by the names that they carry, which we have gradually, through common experience, learned to associate with a type of melon. Therefore, we may say to ourselves, this is a watermelon. This is a cassava melon. This is a cantaloupe. And the very process of so doing seems to bestow upon us some deep and wonderful capacity to grasp the significance of melon. Actually, it does not. If our common experience had resulted in a reversal of the names, we would have used them just as glibly. There is no essential knowledge of the melon to be gained by this type of consideration. But as we look at these two melons, there are other factors that introduce themselves. Once long ago, we went by a melon patch and saw how melons grew. Looking at the melon on the table, we may gain a reminiscence, a recollection of other things about melons. We may remember that an old friend of us told once how to test a ripe one. Almost instinctively, we're going to reach over and see how these live up to expectation. We are also going to begin to think of the value of melon. If these are standing side by side in a grocery stall, we want to know that the one we are buying at a certain price is what it is described to be. We also remember that on a certain occasion we ate too many melons and got sick. We also cannot overlook the fact that we have only certain facilities for the preservation of fruit, therefore we must not load in too many melons, or our icebox or refrigerator will be overstocked. All kinds of side thoughts come up to us about melons. Now, what are these side thoughts? Are they a wise old master of melon mysteries expressing itself through our personality? Actually, it is not this at all. We are not coming to sage and wonderful individual conclusions about melons. What we are really doing is digging out of our memories what we already know about melons. And if we know nothing, nothing is going to come out. And if the information that we have in there about melons is wrong, wrong information is going to come out. If the information was reasonably correct, we suddenly have available to us in one place at one time in a coordinated form that which we subconsciously already know about melons. No more, no less. Thus, what we call thinking is very largely trying to remember what we have already observed about something. It is trying to bring to bear upon our own need something that at one time occurred to another person whom we knew. This is a kind of vicarious way of thinking. Very few people use it intelligently. Then we are also calling upon our education for all kinds of facts that we gained through the years of schooling. Our schooling was poor, the facts are defective. As we go thinking along, which is largely remembering, we are apt to come to serious holes in our recollections. During the week when we were home with the chicken pox, things happened in the schoolroom that we were not there to attend. So somewhere along the way, some fragment of information that might normally have been available to us is just not available. Therefore, in the midst of a seeming knowledge about something, we find ourselves in an immediate state of ignorance. This immediately recommends some consideration or some procedure, especially if the need is immediate and urgent. Therefore, we have encyclopedias, we have dictionaries, we have neighbors, we have all kinds of resources, and if all else goes bad, we can write a long letter to the Secretary of Agriculture, who is always rejoicing at such correspondence, which comes in by the ton. But we are immediately going to try to find out something, but only if that which we desire to know is involved immediately and directly in some challenging situation that seems to have some benefit for ourselves. So much for the common way in which we put together what available facts we possess. The second consideration is that we have to put together facts that are not visible, are not physical, and were not directly received through the sensory perceptions except by means of transmission. We had to use the senses to read about them, or the senses to hear someone else tell us about them. But the senses experienced only transmission, not the fact itself. When someone tells us how life is at the North Pole and we have never been there, his communication does not give us the experience that he had, but it gives us a certain transmission of common or ordinary facts, which may have certain utility. So in the problem of abstract things, we are not able to depend immediately upon personal experience. So we have created great systems of learning. these systems being composed largely of specialists who devote great time and consideration to small areas of intense labor, with the conviction that only in this way can they achieve penetration. Their findings can be transmitted to other people in various degrees. But in these specialized areas, there have also arisen certain sensitivities. One of the common sensitivities of man is his prodigious overestimation of authority. I know many cases in which the individual is, against his own realization, swept away by the old traditional patterns within himself, which has never been able to quite solve or modernize or escape from. Thus, a person will spend hours telling why the entire theory of authority is worthless, but he will stand humbled and abashed in the presence of the first famous person he meets. Whether the famous person knows anything or not isn't even important. He is famous. So we still go out looking for autographs, cut buttons off of people's coats, read with tremendous avidity the scandals of popular heroes, and are deeply impressed by the mere fact that things seem famous or important. Out of fame and importance, therefore, we have developed a sensitivity. And this sensitivity causes us to become peculiarly responsive to what we term authority. Now, responsiveness in this case is merely the activity of a point of attention. If we are not convinced that the person whom we are intending to investigate is important, we have little interest in it. If we do not think his ideas are good, we do not want to bother with them. But if for one reason or another we regard him as exceptional, then we focus attention upon him, becoming more aware of him, more aware of whatever communication that he may make. And the communications of the famous are therefore etched more deeply into our subconscious memory than the communications of those for whom we have little particular respect or interest. Even the communications of those we hate are more deeply traced than those about whom we are indifferent. It follows from this that gradually we have turned over a very large part of the so-called thinking process to formularize solutions to problems. We allow our educators to determine what we need to know. We allow them to tell us when they think we are educated. They do this by conferring upon us a mortarboard and a diploma. We then are convinced, not by anything we know, but by what they have told us, that we are ready to go out and seek fame and fortune. We have been given such instruction as our way of life seem to feel should be impressed upon the subconscious substances of memory. Thus we have our education behind us. And we have it there forever, as long as we live, to be drawn upon for various attitudes, for various beliefs. If our education was highly specialized, there are some areas in which perhaps we are particularly skilled. But this is compensated for by the fact there are other areas in which we know practically nothing. Today, what we know is largely determined by what our race, our world, our culture believes to be knowable or believes to be worth knowing. If general opinion is that a subject cannot be known, we spend little time or attention with it. If we do not believe that it is worth knowing, we are also inclined to give it scant consideration. In this way, a small group, leaders, powerful personalities in various areas become the shepherds of our destinies. They determine what we shall think and how we shall think, not by an immediate despotism of their wills, but by the type of nutrition they feed the mind during the formative years. All the time, also, that this information is being fed into us in various ways, we are also subject to another series of pressures which might be termed the response of the senses to the observed phenomena of life. We hear from educators, particularly those who have some of the old-fashioned Scottish metaphysical point of view, that the honorable man is going to succeed. But our eyes, ears, noses, and throats seem to reveal to us that the dishonest man succeeds quite admirably, and if anything, simply exploits the honest man more audaciously. So what we observe does not always agree with what we are taught. We are assured that our religion is a source of great spiritual consolation, so we receive a certain amount of it. We are not sure, however, in practice or in the testimonies of the senses that religious people are living what they claim to believe. And just as the small boy is torn between parental advice and parental example, which may not be even consistent, man growing up finds the mental coordinator torn between the dogmatic instruction that is poured into it and the much more sprightly experiences with which it is daily confronted. This results in what might be termed divided allegiance. This divided allegiance nearly always ends in some kind of a mental dilemma, which we may call confusion. Things do not seem to work out as we expected them to, perhaps because we tried to work them out on one level while our expectations were on a different level. We are not at all happy when we estimate the quality of our achievements in the terms of the compensations with which they are rewarded. Everywhere there is confusion. And in this confusion, man is torn, usually, between theory and practice, between the old ways as he hears about them and the new ways as he sees them every day. Actually, from such a confusion, he may come to an embitterment. He may be disillusioned. He may reach that peculiar state in which he no longer believes anything. Becomes a total doubting Thomas, a skeptic, or even a cynic. Out of confusion of this kind undoubtedly rises our agnostic and our atheist. He is not a person who has within himself a driving determination to be different or to be negative. He is simply unable to find sense in the phenomena around him. He cannot make theories and practices meet. He cannot see the justice in things which some common faculty in himself perceives to be unjust. Thus we have the mixed mind. And out of this mixture of mind, we have, again, a second level of the two melons on the table. One melon is now, we will say, the code of principles which we have heard about, the great laws that have been given to us, the religions by which our lives were more anciently influenced than at the present time. Here is a wonderful structure of principles, ideals, beliefs, commendments, and commandments. This is one melon. The other melon is the life we know, the people we meet on the street, the boys and girls we went to school with, the young hot rod driver, the spoiled child, the hysterical mother, the alcoholic father, and the forever challenging circumstances of discontent and discord in personal relationships. Which of these is true? How are we going to compare one with the other? So we ultimately reach a state in which the mind itself has to choose between the acceptance of things traditionally true and the recognizing of things which are true by experience. Under such conditions, the mind, by its own very nature, having no qualitative instrument within itself, usually chooses that which is most obvious. The mind accepts experience first, for what happens to us is more real than what can happen to anyone else. What we have seen and heard is more important than what someone else tells us. Therefore, first-hand information has priority. This is one of the reasons why civilizations decline when the conducts of their people decline, and that no matter how great a minority of creative people there may be, civilization cannot survive the disintegration of the moral values of average persons. For these average persons are the perpetual examples, indoctrinating each other and often infecting each other with their common negations and delinquencies. Therefore, we now have the mind as merely something that takes hold upon obvious things, puts them through a kind of an IBM machine, sorts them out. This mind can be extremely accurate, sometimes distressingly so, but it never has any insight about anything. It comes out with the answer that is based upon all the information that has previously been fed into the machine. Though sometimes, as the result of feeding in a conglomerate of information, the answer that comes out appears miraculous. It seems as though this machine was really thinking, but it is still only making use of the elaborate system that has been set up within its own mechanism, by which the mechanism records not only separate factors, but combines them according to powerful systems that we might almost consider to be mechanical logic. But in it all, there isn't a thinker anywhere in the lot. And the same is true in this mental process of arriving at decision. What we finally decide, we say, this is my conclusion. This is often passed down from the bench with great solemnity. The lawyer is assumed to have taken into consideration all factors. The judge is assumed to have the skill to determine all values and to interpret the law accurately. If you ask a judge about this, he will smile probably, and he will point out that to the degree that he is a good judge, he is an IBM machine. The moment the judge says to himself, that poor old man down there, I'm so sorry for him, I just can hardly stand it, justice is apt to go out the window. It is, in law, a detriment to some, but a defense to many, that justice is blindfolded. Because it is not possible in any other way for something that is based entirely upon the concept of fact can function. It has to be that way. So the mental coordinator is out looking for facts. And it has very little understanding of something that might be bigger than facts. And this thing that could be bigger than fact is truth. For truth is more than putting all these elements into a machine. The truth about a thing must penetrate into the innermost nature of that thing. Truth must explain causes. Truth must examine motives. Truth must approach each person as a person and not as an equation. Truth must try to discover the hidden moral forces operating behind facts. And if we are able to discover truth, we are in the presence of something much greater than fact. But the means of the discovery of truth are very strange, curious, and abstract. Now, truth is one of the most comforting, delightful words that we have. We use it just as though it meant something. We confuse it constantly with fact, and we also confuse fact with truth. When we say to a friend of ours, the truth of this matter is, we are really saying, this is the way I think it is. No more. Perhaps one or two further investigations have been made. But most persons do not arrive at truth by research, but by the pressure of opinion. Truth to the individual is what he wants to believe. This is because he has ingeniously escaped from fact. Now, facts are important, but truths have to be built upon facts. You do not eliminate the fact to find the truth. You press through the fact to discover the more part of itself, that which is greater. And without the fact, the truth will be hard to discover. So in this mental process of coordination, truth becomes a kind of overtone. Truth is something that seems to emerge from certain other sources within ourselves, sources beside those which we most commonly use. Suppose we should now exchange our two melons for two very beautiful bowls, one of white porcelain and the other perhaps of glorious green celadon. These are exquisite bowls. They're standing side by side on the table. Both are works of art. So you say to a man, which is the more beautiful of the two? You'll say, that one. Why? Is it really better? No. You will say to another man, which do you like the best? And he will point out the other one. And you might tell these two men that they are not in agreement. The man who likes the white bowl will say that the man who likes the celadon is just simply inexperienced, childish, hasn't any real taste at all. The other chap, if he is not very charitable, will say the same thing. Each will be convinced that his own taste is impeccable, and the other person's highly nondescript. You can't alter this. But why does it occur? Why do we have other factors coming into this situation, by which when we have facts, we are inevitably impelled to take sides about them? We cannot leave facts alone. No one has ever been able to. We must begin to create fields of overtones around these facts. And one of the areas in which we create these overtones is that we place ourselves in some relationship to the fact. Is this fact helpful to me? Is this fact the fact I want? If it is, there is a certain exhilaration, there is a certain appreciation, there is a certain ready recognition. But if this fact comes up with an answer that is totally contrary to my own wishes and desires, I will probably have an engineer in to go over the machine. The machine must be wrong. The individual himself couldn't be wrong. And even if the machine is proved to be in good running order, the individual who does not like the fact that he learns will find one way or another to separate himself from the acceptance of it. Thus we learn that in the course of existence, in the course of living, in the course of building up the various conditions that we know, we have a number of recollections or reminiscences or association mechanisms which have a tendency to interfere with the clear statement of conclusion. We find that with every decision that we make, every situation that arises, that we remember things that were pleasant and unpleasant, fortunate or unfortunate. And these things add their evidence in the weighing of the so-called objective fact. To the simple processes of this IBM procedure, therefore, we add certain experiences at large, experiences that float around and will arise under many conditions and in very strange patterns, experiences which cause us to reject or cause us to question or cause us to exploit the so-called facts, not just to recognize them and go on with them. If man was an unconditioned creature, he could live by unconditioned facts and would be the most dull instrument the nation ever produced, because there is something very dead and sterile about facts. It is difficult to get up and work into a state of enthusiasm on the fact that rains fall or that the tides ebb and flow. These things perhaps can be made into something of significance by the poet, but in the daily experience of living, facts by themselves are not meaningful. Facts are only challenges by which we must come to some extended opinion or conclusion within ourselves. Facts mean what they mean to us. And because we do not have any clear center by which meaning is assured, we go on our grand old way of endless speculation, endless opinion, and continuous conflict with others about the validity of ideas. There is no answer to this in the world as we know it today. There are points in this procedure that have interest to us in our daily living, in the problems that we must all encounter. I think the most important basic lesson is that the study of the mind reveals to us that we simply cannot afford to be pig-headed. We cannot afford to assume that we are always right. We cannot afford to assume that our own thoughts are always important. And we have no right to assume that we really like the things we say we like, or really do not like the things we say we do not like. All of these conclusions arise from a set of factors that are not dependable. We can only assume that at any given moment our thinking is the substance of our attainment. If we have attained much, perhaps our thinking is worth more. If we have attained little, our thinking is worth little. This would be a wonderful way to relieve the world of one of the heaviest plagues with which it is afflicted, egotists. The egotist is the person who has overwhelmingly abdicated in favor of the infallibility of his own mind. He is convinced that this mind is always right because it is his, and that other people's minds are no better than they should be, but his is far better than it could ever hope to be. The egotist is not always a terrible monster, although occasionally we do produce monstrosities in this area. The average egotist is simply a comparatively ignorant person who doesn't know it, who in one way or another has built defenses against realities, has tried desperately to achieve some form of status, who is desperately desirous of being heard, of being appreciated, of being respected, of being admired, without very many basic qualifications. Thus he must advance himself. He must be his own press agent. He must try to impress other people. And he usually finally impresses them with his own ignorance. But perhaps they do not wait to tell him, and he goes happily on his way. But egotism in every department of life is dangerous to clear thinking and to the solution of any of the essential problems of living. There is one wonderful thing we can all do, and that is relax and suspect that there are things that we should know that we do not know, and that we are not going to pass final judgment on anything or anyone until we know more than we know now. This is tremendously helpful in arbitrating what might otherwise be violent head-on collisions. And the worst part of it is there are so many martyrs to these collisions who have died because they thought they were right and they were never right in the first place. We find this true in many different theories of life. We find it true in politics. We find it true in the arts and sciences, where tremendous patterns of opinion have gradually taken over, and individuals are convinced, each in his own case, that his group, his side, his faction is completely right. The other person is completely wrong. This is never more evident than at election time, when people who know none of the candidates become violently upset over the vices and virtues of people they've never met and about whom they know nothing except what appears in a highly prejudiced press. The mental coordinator is best served by the individual gradually supplying it with additional information, knowing that we must depend upon judgment for most of the decisions of life. It becomes important that this judgment shall be as sound, as adequate, as enlightened as possible. Into the mind, which is going to be this coordinator, therefore, we must also cause to flow interesting and valuable information bearing upon problems where thinking is necessary and proper. We must educate the coordinator. This only means that we must provide it with more material upon which to arrive at conclusions. Perhaps our problem calls for a larger IBM circuit than we have. We had the $25,000 machine, but suddenly it looks as though we needed the $190,000 machine. We find that the smaller machine will not do some of the things that the larger machine will do. On the same ground, small minds cannot accomplish what large minds can accomplish. The only answer to this is enlarge the mind. Get more information into the coordinator so that it is able to bring better testimony. Now, the coordinator is able to react to a number of different levels of information. The idealist contributes something to the coordinator. The coordinator's reactions are a little more subtle, a little more gentle, a little more kindly, and a little more penetrating if the individual has been feeding insight into the machine. This doesn't mean the machine has insight, but it means that a new equation is introduced into the large problem. The person who suddenly has strong religious conviction also feeds into the mental coordinator certain moral and spiritual convictions. If these are deeply and truly held, then all judgments by the coordinator must include these equations. They must be part of this pattern. So a man who has had 9 experiences in life, and these are fed into the coordinator, is not quite as able as the man who has had 100 experiences in life. The individual who has lived superficially on the surface of existence from the cradle to the grave can only feed into the coordinator from the level of his own superficial experience. It is useless to think that the individual is shallow on the outside and deep on the inside. This is just not true. He will never be any shallower on the inside than we observe. He will never be any deeper on the outside than the inside can provide. And when he is deeper inside, the outside automatically changes and meets this new situation. So there cannot be a great interval in which an individual is a physical failure in everything, but a great spiritual success at the same time. The individual cannot be always right and always miserable, nor can he be always wrong and always happy. The coordinator must be adjusted. It is then necessary to use the mind primarily to reveal its own shortcomings to itself. By this revelation of shortcoming, which the mind grudgingly brings in, it never does so enthusiastically. It does, however, gain a new insight into itself. Simple example. A man walking across a bridge that looks a little rickety gets out in the middle, thinks it over, and says, I think I can make it. So he continues his way across, the bridge collapses, and he drops into a muddy stream underneath. As he gets out of the water, he rather sadly reflects to himself, I guess I was wrong. Now, in this simple circumstance, the mind has rebuked itself. Nothing new has been added. The individual thought the bridge was strong enough. By experience, he found out that the bridge was not strong enough. Therefore, he knew his thought was wrong. In this tangled procedure of existence, we make such useful discoveries every few minutes. And in the course of time, we come gradually to more and more negative conclusions about the mind. The more we trust our weight upon it, the more we discover ourselves in trouble. Now, why should this be if the mind is factual? The reason why it is true is that while the mind itself is factual according to its own knowledge, the person using the mind is living in an outer universe, a material existence, most of the facts of which are not available to the mind. We do not, as yet, have the answers to hardly any of the basic physical questions of existence. We have some kind of explanation, but almost every year science overthrows one of its own conclusions. Science is a kind of mental process, using the same coordinating instrument. And science is supposedly able to teach itself because it is theoretically willing to admit its own mistakes. It remains close to its facts, and when these are proven wrong, it drops them. Man, however, in the same position, when proven wrong, clings to his error and dies with it. The coordinator is therefore able to discover its own inadequacy. It tries to apply the common knowledge and finds this inadequate. It tries to apply personal experience, but finds that an experience is never actually identically repeated. Therefore, there is always something in the new situation that the old experience did not quite take care of. Then we have to race on to some kind of judgment about it. And in this problem of adapting old experience to new problems, the possibility of error again intrudes. We cannot, with absolute certainty, say that the mind of man is capable of making him happy here and now in this world. If it is not able to do this, then man must either accept misery or must find some way to remedy the situation within his own mind. Nearly all of the ancients agreed that ignorance was the common cause of all disaster. And ignorance is simply a mental coordinating machine with no cards being fed in. And as a result of that, the wheels are going around desperately and nothing comes out. The reason nothing comes out is that nothing went in. There's another type of thing also in which if enough cards are fed in that are themselves inaccurate or incorrect, that which comes out will compound the felony. So ignorance is always the individual not knowing anything, or not knowing the right thing, or desperately conceiving that he knows something that is not true. Any such informations as this, or misinformations, fed in, will certainly come out with a wrong answer. Man's mind therefore, of itself, is continually revealing its own inadequacy. This inadequacy is viewed by consequences. The man who found the bridge broke under him, heard the noise of the breaking, which was contributed to the brain by the ears, and the sudden feeling of being wet, which was contributed by the sense of feeling. He also had his mouth full of water, which contributed to the sense of taste. He saw himself falling, so that his eyes and sight were affected, and in all probability he also had the smell of stale water from the mill pool underneath. All of this evidence was taken back by the sensory perceptions to the coordinator. The coordinator sifted all this through its mechanism and came out with the inevitable conclusion that the bridge wasn't strong enough. You could hardly get away from it. But as it had previously solemnly pronounced that the bridge was strong enough, the coordinator itself is in a dilemma, and the individual dependent upon it can only conclude that the quality of the conclusion reached by the mental coordinator in man is dependent upon the quality of the information which it receives, and not too much can be expected of it at any given time or under any given group of circumstances. Buddha went to work on this problem in connection with his idea of the aggregates, the various experiences which, pouring into man, provide the units from which judgment is compounded. All experience has to come in not only through the sensory perceptions, but through certain other channels of acceptances. If we were sure that every time an individual saw or heard something on the outside of his nature, that the true, perfect, inevitable, and accurate record of these occurrences would pass immediately to the coordinator, we could have more comfort and consolation. But this is not the case. In the process of passing into consciousness, all experience is subject to the vitating process of interpretation. The individual does not honestly accept experience. In most cases, he has to interpret it. And by the time he has gotten through distorting this experience to meet his own preconceptions, that which goes into the coordinator is already morally and ethically and rationally dishonest. Buddha tells us, therefore, that one of the first things we have to do in trying to help this mental process to function is to stop cheating on it. Stop forcing it to be what it should not be. Stop trying to fool it. And also, stop feeding it attitudes and opinions and notions that are not valid. Because if you feed in things which are not true, conclusions that are not true must come out. And when they come out, they will be much more impressive than when they went in, but they will be no truer. To achieve this correction of basic ignorance, there are certain disciplines which antiquity set up, not for the redemption of a God in man. The ancient didn't believe that you had to educate a God in the human soul. What you had to educate was the inside of man himself. For it was not from any God that his troubles sprang, but from himself. Buddha then took the attitude that we must decide in ourselves values. What are we going to ask of this coordinator? What are we going to demand Are we going to demand that every man be a Socrates? Are we going to insist that every one of our children will be a genius? Are we going to stand by and overeducate young people who need to know how to work much more immediately than they need to know Latin verbs? What are we going to do with these factors in our own natures? Buddha recommended very strongly that the human machine, this coordinator, is able to take over a common, reasonable task and perform it in a reasonably efficient manner if we will just stop overloading it and expecting it to perform miracles. Thus, we seem to see something that we don't really appreciate much these days, and that is the strange and wonderful dignity of the commonplace. All of the opinions of our world are made by minorities, and the great majority of mankind goes on unheeded. And yet there may well be more genius in the commonplace than there is in the exceptional. For ages we have recognized the strange integrity of the folk. Our wonderful honesties rest in simple people. How the world's securities have for centuries been maintained by what we commonly call the middle class of people. The people who were sound within themselves, who had principles, who lived within their means, who made no pretenses to virtues they did not possess. They lived simply, and they lived naturally, and they expressed themselves in the simple words they understood, and they were truly the salt of the earth. Every civilization that has ever collapsed has collapsed because of the corruption of its middle class. And this middle class, therefore, may be likened to a moderate-sized machine, a coordinator that is probably all man really needs. Certainly a coordinator which ages of evolution have made available to him. If he doesn't crowd it, if he doesn't pack it, if he doesn't try to run it too fast, if he doesn't attempt to cheat on it, this coordinator will serve reasonably well. It must, however, be given proper care, proper guidance. The machine must be kept in good order. And most of all, it must be operated by a trained operator. If you don't have that tossed into the situation, your repair bills are going to greatly exceed your original investment. So we have the operator that has to run this machine. Though in this particular case, the operator himself seems to be almost part of the machine. But the operator is a level of intelligence originating from the machine, but strangely separated from it by a certain overall experience, which the machine itself cannot completely convey. So the operator is the testimony of the machine, plus insight, plus understanding, plus intuition, plus imagination, from which most of the others came, plus the power to sense in some way that the information provided by the machine is not intended to be thrown away afterwards. This marvelous machine is not intended merely to amaze us. It is intended to provide us with information that we intend to use. And it is only when we begin to bring all these factors together that the information begins to operate as it should. So Buddha, taking this problem of the mental coordinator, began by pointing out that we have to get the rust out of it, perhaps replace a few badly worn or damaged parts, make sure that it is adequately greased, make sure that it is adjusted properly, and having done these things which are necessary to every machine, then proceed to use it wisely. To achieve this, of the bringing of the machine into order, man must estimate, weigh, and measure the ignorance factor, not only in himself, but in the whole world in which he lives. You must realize that the information that comes out of the machine immediately takes on moral overtones. We use this information in some way. If we use this information correctly, it gains for us further information. If we use it incorrectly, it causes for us misery, which also is recorded in the machine itself. So the machine is changing every minute, recording something different every minute. But this changing, shifting, balancing, coordinating is so confusing that the average person has no way of determining the real procedures, and he has to wait until certain mysterious symptoms, symbols, intensities or pressures seem to float into his objective consciousness, whereby he is impelled to conduct or action of some kind. The mental coordinator being what it is, the person must simplify all reactions. He must realize that this machine can be used to build with or to destroy with, that it can contribute to his honesty or make him a careful, skillful, and meticulous thief. It can bring out evidence that will make him love man and God or hate both. But what comes out can only be according to what goes in. Every verdict must be the reasonable interpretation of the factors involved. And this type of verdict often leaves the person on the horns of a dilemma. One mistake begins to breed another. One excess suggests another. And the coordinator goes right along, providing us with all the information which is natural to it about these things, and with no moral compunctions whatsoever, because it doesn't have any. But the occurrences themselves that follow these applications of specialized knowledge have moral consequences in terms of life. So the coordinator, with its sensory perceptions, is suspended in a mysterious way between two conditions of being. The lower condition is the material universe, which is a completely lawful sphere in which the laws themselves are for the most part concealed. The confusion of phenomena obscures the natural directions of nearly everything in the physical world. The laws are there, but we cannot see them. We cannot immediately grasp them. Beyond and above the coordinator is an inflexible and inevitable fact in law itself. The coordinator, therefore, has no actual say in the kind of a world in which it is going to live. It can only say what will happen to the person living in the world as it is, and reacting variously to the stimulation of the calculator or the coordinator. The only answer that the coordinator finally comes to of itself is that through long and patient observation and reflection, it becomes evident that all knowledge, all facts, all conclusions arrive in the end at helpfulness or destructiveness. That all things either bring with them security or cause insecurity. Wherever a security, a well-being, an obvious progress is achieved, the conclusion is called good. Wherever it is obvious that the results are tragic, unfortunate, and miserable, then we assume that the consequences of that process are bad. So everything that the coordinator does leads to something, leads to an application, which in turn has implication. Thus, Buddha tells us that the individual must use the coordinator itself to slowly organize his material relationships with existence. Now, he must then call upon the different levels of the coordinator. The highest level of it is the abstract level. And here the facts are usually known only by tradition. But into this higher level are certain abstract convictions, beliefs, or ideas that seem to have great validity. These must be called upon. Also, there is a middle level in the coordinator, in which it is obvious that growth or change moves things upward or downward, towards the better or toward the worse. And there is the lower level of the coordinator, which simply concerns itself with creature comforts, which concerns itself with immediacies, in which the immediate takes precedent over the real, and the instant dominates eternity. These different levels, each has experience according to itself. And the individual has to work through these levels through the patient guidance of the machine by which he thinks. Having realized that he can do things for this machine and to it, that in his rage he can break it, or that because he is a good operator it will last longer in his keeping, whereas if he is a careless operator, defects appear much sooner in the mechanisms. He has much to do with maintaining the efficiency of the instrument. And for him, in his daily living, efficiency means the increase of the factual and the truthful content, and the gradual building into the coordinator of things which, when they come out, will be pleasant, happy, constructive, and useful. If, then, we take into this coordinator an overwhelming grief or an overwhelming grievance, the wheels go round, and in the end there comes out something that is morbid and unsatisfactory and destructive to our peace of mind. There's only one way in Buddhism to prevent this, and that was to stop the inflow of it, to gradually reduce the intensities of the things which bombard the calculator. Thus, Buddha holds out for fact, but not for the exaggeration and the distortion of fact. He points out, for example, that there is no reason why men should not be comfortable. There is no virtue in misery, even for great causes, unless it's absolutely necessary. But the individual cannot afford to make comfort his total purpose for life. When he is willing to sacrifice honor for comfort, he's in a bad way. Therefore, he has to determine the amount of intensity that he can afford to bestow upon any one of these factors or coordinating elements. If he is able to gradually reduce his own illusions about things, illusions which arise not only because the coordinator is organizing existing information, but because it is carrying the karmic load of previous information. The individual comes into this world for only one reason, namely because he is ignorant. Now, this is a disillusioning thought. Yet very few people in their right mind can ultimately come to the conclusion that they are here in reward for something. There seems to be only one excuse for being here, and that is that there's something the matter with us. The more we know people, the more we come to the common conclusion that we're all in a little trouble. So we have not excellence of penetration and perfection of judgment to start with. We haven't fallen from perfection into our present state. We are slowly climbing out of imperfection, one awkward step at a time. That's the reason why we are here. Because we are here, we can improve. And the individual who can no longer find any grounds for improvement is dead already. Having decided that we can improve, we must discover how, in what way, and by what means. Buddha says that we can improve definitely by getting emotion and pressure out of our relationships with life. As long as every relationship between the coordinator and the outer life is pressured by the inordinate intensities of the sense perceptions, we will never get a faithful judgment or an honest report on anything. The only way we can really feed the coordinator useful knowledge is by making a program out of finding this knowledge, doing something with it, and providing it in an attractive, usable form to the coordinating factor. If we wish to study botany, we can, in 8 or 10 years of specialized study, feed into this coordinator enough specialized botanical knowledge so that we can make this field our profession, can gain some reputation in it, and can, upon demand or upon our own interest, identify countless forms of plant life, understand at least the outer forms of their processes, and gradually we'll gain some insight of other things from our great familiarity with plant life. Burbank discovered many wonderful fragments of universal philosophy from his love of plants. But Burbank worked with plants. He learned the facts. He fed these facts into the coordinator. And as a result, he came out with judgment, understanding, and security so far as those facts were concerned. But when he was asked to come down to San Francisco and take a pulpit and preach in a church, Mr. Burbank didn't have his facts anymore. It wasn't his world. Somebody took it for granted that because Burbank was a good man in horticulture, he should make an excellent preacher. That is the burden of being famous. You're expected to know many things you can't possibly know. As a result, Burbank said things which were totally inconsistent with his own convictions. He was so confused as a timid little old gentleman who had no experience with these things that he couldn't be heard beyond the third row, which was perhaps just as well. And he went home heartbroken and misunderstood, and an unkindly press made a miserable situation for him, simply because he was totally out of his field. Now, this happens to everyone. We are all totally out of our fields if we go beyond that which is the common knowledge which we have attained. But we can specialize various areas in the effort to become more proficient in those things most needed at this time for our growth and integration. If we are willing to spend 12 to 14 years learning engineering, or astronomy, or biology, we should certainly realize that we must spend similar effort and similar time in the process of actually creating an adequate mental coordinator. This will not be handed to us on a silver platter. We are not assured of it because our parents were brilliant people. We are not in any way safe as far as our mental equipment is concerned until experience itself proves that we have a large measure of common sense. The problem then is to cultivate it, to develop it, to feed into this integrator, this coordinator, the type of information which will result in a well-ordered life. That by the constant procedure of physically experiencing contact with other things, we come to valid conclusions about the meaning of this type of contact. We are not deceived by appearances. We are not victimized by the intensities of our own emotions. We do not blame other people because we are in trouble because of our own ignorance. We realize that between ourselves and the things we want to be and the coordination that we want to have are the three deadly enemies of integration: ignorance, superstition, and fear. As long as these dominate conduct, and as long as ulterior motive dominates practice, the coordinator is going to be corrupted. Because it is corrupted, it cannot serve us, and we cannot depend upon it. Either the person has to have an orderly, integrated, constructive process of thinking, or else he is going to be victim to the miseries of his own mental mistakes. We see this every moment as we go along. We see the individual under the intensities of some pressure within himself, dedicating his life to useless ends. We see him passing along as a spectacular, meteoric success, only to experience at the same time the miseries of broken families, broken health, and broken homes. These various processes in which the coordinator gives false judgment all lead to trouble. Buddha pointed out that the greatest false judgment that the coordinator can possibly feed out to us, coming in turn from the greatest misinterpretation of phenomena that we can feed into the coordinator, is that the material world is a tremendously important, utterly vital sphere, and that success here is everything, and failure here is the most desperate dilemma that we can face. Buddha was convinced that this attitude, which is too widespread, was simply, basically false. And in order to prove it was false, he fed a number of facts into his own coordinator and came out with some rather interesting conclusions. We can say clearly that they are conditioned conclusions. He believed that a certain thing was going to come out, and it did. On the other hand, other people who didn't believe have also put the same facts to their coordinator and have come out with his answer, so that in probability he had at least the wisdom or the insight to hold attitudes which were very close to the facts, which is one of the most happy things that can happen to a person. Buddha pointed out that if this tremendous intensity with which we lock ourselves into material existence was valid, then we would not and could not be created as we are. We could not be brought into this world with the hazards of this world and forced to pass through the various experiences of this world And finally, having gained in some measure or some degree the respect of the world, or at least its fear, in the midst of our successes, in the midst of our achievements, we are cut down. Actually, as Buddha pointed out, the whole pageantry of this world is summed up in a simple statement. Man is born, man suffers, and man dies. You can add some garnish here and there. You can wrap it in tin foil. You can tie ribbons around it, but these are the facts. And they are the facts that most people desperately, relentlessly reject. They reject them by ignoring them. They reject them by living in complete nonconformity with them. They continue every strategy that they have as though they were going to be able to go on with it forever. And as I've mentioned once before, I know a case where a man foreclosed his mortgage on his deathbed. He could get a few more dollars that way. And strange as it may seem, this man had no heirs. He just realized that he could sit up once more and make another dollar, and then drop back into oblivion. Why? What is the purpose? What has gotten into man? By means of which he has allowed the coordinator to be so completely hypnotized by the various projects which men have set up among themselves that he has lost all sight of the impermanence of everything, that he has lost all sight of the fact that he is here today and gone tomorrow. And with the freeways as they are, tomorrow may be sooner than he thinks. With a philosophy of life that can only mean anything if he lives forever, he also cheerfully kills himself and others, trying to save a few seconds in rapid transit. 40,000 persons are killed every year in automobile accidents alone, most of which are preventable. But nobody cares. Here we have a world in which we do not know where we came from, most people. We do not know why we are here, and we haven't the slightest idea of where we are going, if anywhere. And yet we build in this little oasis a completely nonsensical system of existence. A system that makes sense to no one, but is sanctified by the veneration of ages. Buddha said this acceptance of this system, this belief that it has to be right because it had always been that way, the fact that we have to be in style because otherwise we are ridiculous, causes us to overlook the fact that the style itself is ridiculous, and that by following it we can only look worse than we did before. Everything is according to a pattern based upon the approval of other foolish people for the foolish things that we do. On one occasion in the forum, Socrates was discoursing when the audience broke into violent applause. He turned quickly to one of his disciples and said, "What foolish thing have I said? They are all applauding me," taking it for granted that they would only applaud error. Actually, we have to face a very interesting fact, that we can make the mistakes that everyone makes. We can share in the foolishness of whole generations, but the payment we must face alone. Whatever we do wrong, no matter how many other people slap us on the back and say how wonderful we are, if we have broken a law, we must pay the penalty of that law alone. In those hours, all the backslappers can do us no good. And if we have neglected facts and truths and are stricken down with some helpless or hopeless ailment, the fact that other people applauded what we previously did is of no importance whatsoever. We have to keep the rules if we want to escape from the solitary suffering that follows all broken law. Buddha then suggested we get these things down to size, where we can see them, where we can work with them, where we can do something about them in the daily existence of our own needs, and the daily experience of our own problems. The mental coordinator should be fed the simplest possible arrangement of factors. Nothing should be fed into it that we do not want to have come out of it. And no matter whether we will or not, anything and everything will be fed into it that is sustained by the intensity of our own emotional or mental energy. Whether we are conscious or not, every hate and every love will be fed into that machine. Whether we know it or not, everything we think is wonderful will be fed in as something wonderful. Everything we think is terrible will be fed in as something terrible. And because the wonderful and the terrible arises not from fact but from opinion, we are not sure to what degree these various elements deserve the pressure which has been bestowed upon them, and this pressure which in turn must later powerfully influence future conduct. So keep the pressures low. Meet all things in life as quietly as possible, because this coordinator also speeds up when we demand things from it. And when we demand hasty conclusions from the coordinator, the processes are not accurate. Keep the pressures quiet. Lower the need for mental solution by keeping out of the problems that cause the need for mental solution. So some will say this sounds like a very dull life, that the individual is really having a wonderful time because he is rolling around in an ocean of his own intensities. But he's not. He's seasick and always has been in this kind of transportation. What he really means is that there is no demand upon him. He can do as he pleases. He doesn't have to use his willpower, and he is not contemplating what will happen 5 years later as a result. Take it as it is. Let the future take care of itself, but the future is catching up to him every minute. The coordinator is best equipped and best solved when we keep the pressures low. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't have interesting things. Psychology is discovering today, for instance, that pressure is not at all a synonym of real depth of feeling. Very often the deepest and most wonderful experiences of our lives are very quiet, very simple experiences. We get much more excited over trivia than we do over real issues. We can be angry with 100 trivial occurrences and resent 1,000,000 different small, nagging incidents. But when the average person of reasonable maturity is confronted with a really great problem, one of the great moments of life, he is usually quiet. He usually meets this with a great depth of determination that is not emotional, that is not pressure-ridden, but has a strange, devout decision in it. Very often in old times, in these great moments of life, man had recourse to prayer. He asked divine guidance. Prayer is disappearing from most modern homes, unfortunately. And in its place, we have greater intensity. Most neurotics have forgotten how to pray. They have no longer the ability to simplify, to place anything in the hands of God or any superior power. They have to carry the full load of their own miseries themselves, and they're inadequate, because they've never built anything in the coordinator to solve misery. They've only fed it with misery from the beginning. To simplify, to clarify, to reduce pressure, means actually to bring all the values of life into complete focus. We can do anything we want to, and do it beautifully and graciously and conveniently, if we stop forcing, if we stop pressing, and if we begin to graciously use the powers and faculties that we possess. So we take things more quietly, more easily, and as a result, we think more on a constructive level. Because we are a little less intense, we are not so sure that everyone else is wrong. Because we do not nurse a hatred so powerfully, we do not entirely forget that our adversary has his virtues. Little by little, the moderation of these intensities makes possible the realization of facts. And we come to the final conclusion that the fact is that nothing is all right and nothing is all wrong. Having thus taken the edge off of these tremendous upheavals, which force a mass of erroneous statistics upon the coordinator, we find that the processes of the machine itself begin to smooth out. The answers are no longer dogmatic. They are suggestive answers, things to help us. The conclusions are no longer infinite and inevitable. Rather, they reveal rather clearly that they are according to the facts available. They are not dogmatic. They always allow that other facts could exist and undoubtedly do exist. But little by little, by this procedure, we reduce our living to a reasonable, practical, livable level. We find pleasure in things that do not entirely agree with us. We get a new concept of this problem of togetherness. To us, togetherness means that the other person must have the same allegiances that we have, must agree with us, must like what we like, must dislike what we dislike. And this is especially a problem for children in divided homes. Actually, togetherness means nothing of the kind. Togetherness means that neither person is an egotist. And by this virtual law alone, they can get together very pleasantly. It is never a problem of somebody being always right and somebody being always wrong. As soon as we get rid of that tremendous false overtone of infallibility, which we do not merit, we will find that it is possible to share differences and in that way enrich both persons. We are not really benefited because other people think the same way we do. We are benefited when other people can lead our thinking, not in their direction, but in the direction of a greater truth. The adventure of sharing new ideals is the real privilege of togetherness. But today it depends largely upon the fact that one person has a dogmatic attitude and the other one accepts it. This is about the same type of togetherness that we used to find in the two horses on a beer truck, where one horse did all the pulling and the other horse led him. And this is the way it has always been. In the working with this mental coordinator, which is not a person, but a process in our personality, it is just as surely the monument to our collective nature as our physical possessions are monuments to our ingenuity or our tenacity in certain areas of activity. As we build houses, so we build characters. As we grow, we develop new internal attitudes which help us to grow further. And growth is a process that begins wherever you start. At any moment, the individual can begin to improve the processes of his own consciousness. He can do it by relaxing away from the various intemperances and intolerances of attitudes which lock the coordinator. He can develop an open mind, a seeking mind, a searching mind. He can rejoice in new ideas instead of trying to exterminate them. He can be glad that other people do not agree with him, but hopes that everyone of good sense agrees with themselves to at least a reasonable degree. If we had this type of thing, we would have no religious intolerances. We would have none of the race tolerances that burden us. For all intolerances represent some defect in the proper attitudes of the mind. And where the mind is so perversely affected that it cannot find solutions, it then begins to create antagonisms and discords. If man had devoted half the energy to the solution of his problems that he now expends in objecting to other people, the race would be in the golden age long ago. But we cannot break through these patterns. And unless we do, we live and die with them. And the person who says that this mind is himself is correct to the degree that it represents the sum of his present attainment. But if he says, in speaking of his mind, that it is an infallible, sacred, spiritual self within him, upon which he can have absolute dependence, this is not true. The only thing he can depend on is that the results of action will be consistent with the causes. And wherever a person is in trouble, the causes have caused the trouble. And we are either happy, adjusted people, or we need to grow. And the only way we can grow is by recognizing this need and accepting it as more important than the continual perpetuation of thoughtlessness. The moment we find that our lives are not happy, we know that our facts are not straight. And by taking this seriously to heart and going to work with it, we begin to clear up things. And when things begin to clear up, we feel better. Our friends feel better. Our neighbors feel better. And little by little, a betterness of this kind extends out into society. Society is changed not by mass motion, but by the improvement of the internal coordination of the individual. When enough people are right, the world is right. And when we are right, essentially right, we are in agreement. Therefore, the fact that the world is in agreement on very little indicates that the world is not right about very much. And because we are inconsistent in our own dedication, we are not very sure. So we have to look with a suspicious eye at that machine and begin to wonder whether we can afford the extravagance of letting it go along without leadership, without guidance, without purpose, and without capitalizing on its product. We therefore seriously feel that each individual should think through, with the coordinator itself, the consequences of this expensive and luxurious piece of equipment, and make sure that in practical terms it is paying for itself. If it isn't, it's up to him to see that it does. Well, we'll now go home and examine our coordinators. Thank you very kindly, and see you next week.